The sky over Earth had never looked so dark. It was as though the very heavens themselves were closing in. In the distance, thousands of ships, massive and menacing, broke through the atmosphere. The Kranthor Empire had arrived. They were the most feared warlords in the galaxy, a ruthless and advanced species that had conquered countless worlds. And now, they had set their sights on Earth. The Kranthor ships, shaped like jagged blades of obsidian, cast shadows over cities as they descended. Each ship was a behemoth of death, bristling with weapons capable of obliterating entire cities with a single blast. The sound of their engines filled the air, a deep, ominous hum that sent a chill through the bones of everyone who heard it. There was no escaping them. As the ships entered Earth's orbit, humanity's first line of defense fired its weapons, launching missiles into space, trying to strike at the Kranthor ships before they could land. But it was useless. The Kranthor had technology far beyond anything humans had ever seen. Their shields were unbreakable, and their weapons were devastating. The missiles exploded harmlessly against the force fields surrounding the invader ships, and the Kranthor fleet barely flinched. In the United States, the military gathered its best generals and strategists to formulate a defense. But even they knew, deep down, that this was not a battle they could win. The Kranthor had crushed countless civilizations before, and Earth was next. As news spread of the alien arrival, panic spread across the world. Governments issued emergency alerts, urging people to stay inside. But it was too late. The Kranthor were here. The invasion had begun. In the middle of it all, Captain Sarah Drake stood in a military command center, watching the chaotic scenes unfold on monitors in front of her. She was a fighter pilot, a veteran of wars fought on Earth's soil, but she had never faced an enemy like this. The reports were flooding in. Cities were burning, people were fleeing, and no one knew how to stop the Kranthor. "They've breached the atmosphere," one of the officers said, his voice shaky. "Our defenses are useless against them. We're outmatched." Captain Drake didn't respond immediately. Her mind was racing. She had seen battles before, but this felt different. The Kranthor were unlike any other enemy. They didn't just invade to conquer, they destroyed. They had the power to erase entire civilizations from existence, leaving nothing but ash in their wake. Drake's eyes focused on the screen, where the first Kranthor warship was now hovering above a major city. It was massive, like a floating fortress. The city's defense forces fired everything they had: laser beams, rockets, energy blasts. But none of it seemed to have any effect. The Kranthor ship fired back, a single blast that obliterated a building the size of a skyscraper. The shockwave rippled through the streets, sending debris flying in every direction. People screamed and ran, but there was nowhere to hide. The Kranthor had landed. Captain Drake clenched her fists. She had trained for this moment her entire life, but she had never imagined a threat this powerful. Earth's military was strong, but it wasn't enough. Not against an enemy with this kind of strength. But Sarah Drake was not the type to give up. As the captain of a special fighter squadron, she had fought in wars before, facing impossible odds. She had lost friends, seen comrades fall, but she had always believed in the power of human resilience. No matter how powerful the enemy, humans never surrendered. "Prepare the fighters," she ordered, her voice steady. "We're going up." Her team was ready. They had trained for situations like this, against overwhelming odds, against invaders who thought they could crush humanity without a second thought. The pilots quickly climbed into their sleek fighters, their engines roaring to life as they took off into the sky. Captain Drake led them, their small fleet of human ships heading straight for the Kranthor. The Kranthor didn't seem to notice them at first. Their warships were too busy bombarding the cities below, destroying everything in their path. The humans fired their weapons, lasers streaking across the sky, but the Kranthor's shields absorbed every shot. The human fighters were too small, too weak, and too few. But the humans had something the Kranthor didn't: courage. you said. As they closed in on the Cran 4 flagship, Captain Drake gave the signal. All fighters, focus fire on that ship. We have to take it down. The fighters swarmed the Cran 4 flagship, dodging energy blasts and laser fire. They aimed for the weak spots they had identified in the Cran 4's shields. For every shot they landed, they lost a fighter, but they pushed on. Drake's squadron was determined. They would not be the first human civilization to fall without a fight. As the battle raged on, Captain Drake's fighter was hit. Warning lights flashed across her dashboard, and the craft spun uncontrollably. She fought to regain control, her heart pounding in her chest. The Cran 4 flagship loomed ahead, its size almost overwhelming. But Drake was not afraid. She had been in situations like this before. This time, she wouldn't let Earth fall. Focus, she yelled into her comms. We take down that flagship, or we don't have a chance. The fight was far from over. The humans were outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered, but the battle had just begun. The Cran 4 may have thought they were invincible, but Earth would show them just how wrong they were. In the distance, Drake saw the first signs of hope, a flicker of energy from the ancient technology humans had recovered from long-forgotten ruins. The Cran 4 may have the firepower, but humanity had something they didn't, ingenuity. And that, Captain Sarah Drake knew, was how they would win. The fight for Earth had only just begun. Captain Sarah Drake stood at the edge of the military command center, staring at the screen displaying the chaos unfolding across the world. Cities were burning, governments were crumbling, and the Cran 4 were showing no signs of stopping. Earth's military forces had already thrown everything they had at the invaders, but their weapons were useless against the alien armée. The Cran 4's shields were impenetrable, their weapons devastating, and their ships seemed endless. As the Cran 4 warships continued to hover over major cities, causing destruction with every blast, a grim silence fell over the command center. Captain Drake's mind raced. She was a fighter pilot, trained for speed and agility. But this was a war like no other. The situation was dire. Her thoughts turned to her family, to Earth, and to everything that was now at risk. Captain Drake, a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see General Thomas Ralston, the highest-ranking officer in the room. He was an old man, his face etched with worry, but his voice was firm. We need a plan. Now. Drake nodded. We don't have the firepower to match them head-on, but we do have something they don't expect. We have our will to fight. The general sighed but nodded in agreement. You're right. We've lost contact with several of our military units. We don't know where the Cran 4 are landing next, but I just received a report about a potential advantage. Drake raised an eyebrow. What advantage? Ancient technology, the general replied, his voice lowering. We've been researching artifacts and old technology for years now. Some of it is more advanced than anything we've ever seen. The scientists believe we might have found something that could turn the tide. Drake's eyes widened. She knew exactly what the general was referring to. The ancient weapons. The ones we've only begun to study. Yes, they're based on a power source we've never fully understood, but the engineers think they can make it work. We need to act fast before the Cran 4 get any closer to our major defense hubs. Drake took a deep breath. This could be their only chance to mount any sort of defense. The Cran 4 might be technologically superior, but humanity had something far stronger. Adaptability, resourcefulness, and the courage to fight back. Where are these weapons? She asked quickly. The research facility in Nevada, Ralston said. It's a long shot, but it's our best hope. Without hesitation, Captain Drake turned to her team. Get ready. We're going to Nevada. As Drake and her squadron of elite pilots prepared to head out, the world was in a state of panic. Major cities were being systematically wiped off the map by the Cran 4. People ran for shelter, but nowhere was safe. Governments declared martial law, and fear gripped every nation. In the heart of New York, the Cran 4's forces had already begun their systematic invasion. The warships hovered in the sky, their immense size casting shadows over the city below. The alien warriors, their armor shimmering in the sunlight, moved in squads, clearing streets, taking prisoners, and executing anyone who resisted. It seemed there was no hope. But in the midst of this destruction, one thing became clear to the people of Earth. They were not going to give up without a fight. In the underground bunkers, military personnel worked around the clock to coordinate the defense. While the Kranthor's forces advanced, small pockets of human resistance began to form. Ordinary citizens, soldiers, and survivors from all walks of life came together, armed with whatever they could find. Makeshift weapons, old technology, and the occasional military-grade equipment were their only defenses. The resistance knew they were facing impossible odds, but they were united by one thing: the will to survive. And they would fight, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. Meanwhile, Captain Drake and her team were airborne, flying toward the Nevada facility. The mission was dangerous, and the odds were slim. Their squadron was outnumbered, and their enemy was seemingly invincible. But Drake felt something stir inside her. This wasn't just about saving Earth anymore. It was about proving something. The Kranthor had never faced an enemy like humanity. As the team neared their destination, Drake looked out at the horizon. The sky was filled with streaks of light, signs of the ongoing battle between Earth's forces and the Kranthor. Each explosion from the distant cities was a painful reminder of how far humanity had fallen, but it was also a symbol of resistance. The Kranthor might have the firepower, but they didn't have the resolve of the human spirit. The Kranthor had never experienced anything like it. For the first time in centuries, they were forced to pause, to think, to reconsider their methods. Their initial confidence was beginning to falter. The humans, weak, primitive, and on the brink of extinction, had proven more resilient than expected. Lord Zorath had underestimated them. And now, the Kranthor were finding themselves on the defensive. In the war rooms across the globe, humanity's leaders had been hard at work, forming alliances between military powers and gathering whatever resources they could find. What was once a disjointed effort became a united front. The resistance forces had begun to strike back in unexpected ways. Armed with the knowledge from ancient technology they'd recovered, humanity now had weapons capable of disrupting the Kranthor's seemingly invincible shields. Captain Sarah Drake stood in a makeshift command center, surrounded by maps and holographic displays. Sweat trickled down her forehead, but her expression was one of unwavering determination. The recent victories had given her people hope, but she knew the Kranthor would soon escalate their attacks. They had pushed back the invaders before, but this was only the beginning. "We can't stop now," Drake said, her voice resolute. "We've gained some ground, but they'll come back stronger. We need to hit them harder." Lieutenant Hayes, standing at her side, nodded. "We've analyzed their patterns. They're focused on securing their power sources. If we strike there, we could cripple their entire fleet." Drake paused, considering the plan. The Kranthor had already demonstrated their ability to respond quickly, and any mistake could lead to devastating consequences. But she had no choice. Humanity's survival depended on it. "We'll do it. We'll hit them where it hurts." Hours later, a squadron of fighters, led by Captain Drake, was in the air, soaring toward a Kranthor power station deep in enemy territory. This was the heart of their operations, where they drew the energy that powered their warships and shields. Destroy it, and the Kranthor fleet would be severely crippled. The journey was perilous. The Kranthor's forces were everywhere, patrolling their territory with an iron grip. But the humans had learned to navigate their defenses, using stealth and speed to their advantage. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best they had. As Drake's fighter squadron approached the target, the vast landscape of the Kranthor stronghold loomed below them, a stark contrast to the destroyed cities of Earth. The power station was surrounded by large towers emitting bursts of energy, and the warships hovered ominously above. It was heavily guarded, but the humans had one advantage the Kranthor hadn't anticipated: the element of surprise. "On my mark," Captain Drake's voice came through the comms, steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We hit fast and hard. Take out their energy fields, and then move out. No time for a prolonged fight." The squadron acknowledged, and Drake's heart raced. She had led many missions before, but this one felt different. The stakes had never been higher. If they failed here, humanity might not get another chance. The moment arrived. "Go," Drake shouted. The human fighters dove toward the power station with speed and precision. The Kranthor forces reacted quickly, launching anti-air fire toward them, but the humans dodged and weaved, evading the incoming blasts. They were small, fast, and unpredictable. Everything the Kranthor had failed to anticipate. Drake's heart pounded as her fighter locked onto the power station's energy core. "Target locked," she muttered, pressing a button to release the payload. The missile shot forward, slicing through the air, hitting the energy core with a massive explosion. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Then the shockwave hit. The explosion was massive, sending ripples of energy through the sky. The Kranthor's shields flickered, their power source disrupted, and their fleet began to lose power. It was working. The humans had done it. But there was no time to celebrate. The Kranthor's response was swift. Within seconds, the remaining warships began to descend, unleashing a devastating barrage of firepower aimed directly at the fighters. "Move out," Drake yelled, watching as one of her squadron members was caught in a blast, their fighter exploding in a fiery display. The squadron took evasive action, firing back with everything they had. "Captain, we've got incoming," Hayes shouted over the comms. The explosion that ripped through the Kranthor power station echoed in the hearts of every human still standing. It wasn't just an attack on the enemy's infrastructure, it was a symbol of defiance. Humanity, once on the brink of destruction, had struck back, and they had hurt the Kranthor. Captain Sarah Drake stood before a large tactical map in the Underground Resistance Command Center, her gaze fixed on the blinking red dots representing Kranthor warships scattered across the globe. Each red light was a target, each one a reminder of the ongoing war. The Kranthor had retaliated with brutal force, but the humans had dealt a blow that was harder to ignore. The fight for Earth had entered a new phase. "We did it," Lieutenant Hayes said, her voice filled with awe. She had never seen her commander quite like this. Calm, focused, determined. But they both knew the victory came at a steep cost. Dozens of fighters had been lost, and the Kranthor had already begun regrouping. Still, their first real setback had shaken the invaders. Drake nodded without a word. Her mind was already working on the next move. They had gained some ground, but this was far from over. The Kranthor were wounded, but they were still powerful, and their retaliation would be swift. But humanity had learned one thing from this fight. If the Kranthor thought they could crush Earth like every other world, they were sorely mistaken. "We've got their attention," Drake said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the tactical map. "We need to keep hitting them where it hurts. Disrupt their command structure. Hit their supply lines." Hayes leaned forward, her fingers tapping on the map as she analyzed the enemy positions. "They're regrouping. There's a fleet gathering near the Atlantic. Looks like they're preparing to launch a counteroffensive. That's where we strike next," Drake said, her voice cold and unwavering. "We can't give them the chance to recover. We hit them now, before they have a chance to retaliate. We'll take out their reinforcements." The next few days were a blur of frantic planning, strategy meetings, and coordinating strikes. The Resistance knew they had a narrow window to act. The Kranthor were regrouping and rebuilding their strength, but they were still vulnerable. Every mission, every strike, had to count. Drake and her team were preparing for one of the most dangerous missions yet, infiltrating the Kranthor's supply hub, located deep within a heavily fortified city on the coast. If they succeeded in sabotaging this key location, the Kranthor fleet would be unable to maintain its operations for long. As Drake prepared to lead her squadron into the heart of enemy territory, she felt the weight of the moment. This was more than just another mission. This was a chance to cripple the Kranthor's supply lines and buy humanity the time they desperately needed. "Captain, we've got a full squadron ready," Hayes said, stepping into the room. "Everyone's locked and loaded. We're ready to go." Drake nodded, adjusting her flight suit. "I know the odds, but this mission is critical. We hit them hard, then get out. No heroics. We don't have the numbers to fight them head-on. We just need to cause as much damage as we can." The squadron took off under the cover of darkness, making their way toward the Kranthor's heavily fortified city. The coast was lined with warships, their massive forms hovering like shadows against the moonlight. The Kranthor had placed all their focus on their command center and their supply lines, making it the perfect target. As they approached the target, Drake's heart pounded. The enemy defenses were formidable. Anti-air weapons fired sporadically in the distance, but the squadron continued undeterred. They were ghosts in the night, invisible, moving too fast for the Kranthor to react. Drake's fighter was the first to make the strike, releasing a set of precision bombs onto a critical supply depot. The explosion rocked the ground beneath them, sending a wave of shock through the Kranthor lines. But there was no time to celebrate. The Kranthor responded immediately, launching counterattacks from every angle. "Incoming," Hayes yelled over the comms. "We got enemy fighters on our tail." Drake gritted her teeth. The Kranthor were learning. Their fighters were faster now, and their weapons more precise. It was a race against time. The Kranthor couldn't afford to lose these supply routes, and humanity couldn't afford to fail. "Stay tight," Drake ordered, her voice steady. "We got one shot at this." The squadron fought their way through the air, dodging incoming fire, releasing bombs with precision as they struck key supply depots and communication hubs. Every strike was a small victory. Every explosion was a signal to the Kranthor that humanity wasn't backing down. As Drake's fighter looped around for another run, a massive explosion rocked the city below. The supply depot they targeted was destroyed, along with a Kranthor communication tower. The Kranthor's fleet had just lost its ability to coordinate. The momentum had shifted. "We did it," Hayes said, breathing heavily. "They can't resupply." Drake exhaled sharply. "Not yet. We got one more thing to do." The resistance fighters made their way back to base, but as they neared the outskirts of the city, they were met with overwhelming Kranthor force. Warships and fighters swarmed the skies, and the ground was filled with alien foot soldiers, ready to avenge the loss. Drake's fighter shook as enemy fire struck it. She could feel the vibration in the cockpit, but she didn't falter. "We've done enough. Get back to base. Now." But as they turned to flee, a warning flashed on Drake's dashboard. A Kranthor warship, much larger than anything they'd encountered before, had appeared from behind a cloud cover. It was moving directly toward them, and the odds were stacked against them. The warship's weapons charge. "Brace for impact," Hayes shouted. Drake's mind raced, but there was no time to think. Her squadron split, trying to evade the oncoming barrage, but the massive warship was relentless. Then, just as the warship's weapon fired, a series of explosions rang out in the distance. Several fighter jets from an allied resistance group, previously thought to be wiped out, swooped in from the clouds, launching a series of missiles at the Kranthor ship. The warship's shields flickered and failed under the pressure. In a split second, the warship exploded, a massive fireball lighting up the night sky. The enemy's fire ceased, and the remaining Kranthor forces were thrown into disarray. The resistance had just delivered a crushing blow. "We're clear," Drake said, her voice thick with disbelief. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity had struck a decisive blow. The Kranthor were reeling, their command disrupted, and their resupply cut off. But the battle was far from over. Humanity had taken a huge step forward, but their fight was just beginning. As Drake's squadron returned to base, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Kranthor had underestimated them once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The tide was turning, and the invincible warlords had met their match. The Kranthor were not accustomed to defeat. Their empire had crushed countless civilizations, each one too weak, too divided, or too insignificant to stand up to their overwhelming force. But what had happened on Earth was different. For the first time, they were facing a species that fought back with unexpected ingenuity, resilience, and a hunger for survival that they hadn't anticipated. Lord Zorath stood in his command center, seething with rage. The humans had dared to strike at the heart of his empire, disrupting his carefully laid plans and leaving him with a fleet that was bruised and battered. His once perfect invincibility was crumbling, and that was something he couldn't tolerate. "Get me the tactical reports," Zorath demanded, his voice cold and dangerous. "The humans will pay for this insolence." His advisors quickly rushed to bring him the information. The resistance had struck hard, hitting supply lines, power sources, and even crucial communication hubs. But the most dangerous blow had been their successful attack on the Kranthor command structure, an attack that had caused their forces to temporarily lose coordination and strategy. "We've been caught off guard, Lord Zorath," one of his commanders said, bowing low. "The humans have demonstrated unexpected strength. They've also formed alliances with some of the neighboring species, who are now providing additional support. They are preparing for another strike on our homeworld." Zorath's eyes narrowed. "How many ships remain?" "Enough to launch a counteroffensive, but we must act fast. The humans are becoming bolder. They are organizing in ways we hadn't thought possible. They've united, something most species would never manage to do in the face of such overwhelming force." Zorath's anger flared, but he quickly regained control. He knew that he had underestimated humanity, and that would be the last mistake he ever made. The humans had begun to turn the tide, but he would show them the true power of the Kranthor. "It's time to show them why we are the masters of the galaxy," Zorath declared coldly. "Prepare the full fleet. We strike at dawn." Meanwhile, Captain Sarah Drake and the human resistance were preparing for their next big move. The recent successes had reinvigorated their spirit, but they knew the Kranthor would retaliate with everything they had. Humanity had seen the crack in the Kranthor's armor, and now they had to push forward, before the invaders could regroup and retaliate. The Resistance's command center was buzzing with activity. Scientists were working on new weapons, strategists were poring over enemy data, and pilots were sharpening their skills for the coming battle. Drake stood at the center of it all, her mind racing. The last mission had cost them dearly. Many lives had been lost, and there was no guarantee that the next one would go as smoothly. But they had no choice. They had to keep pushing, or humanity would fall. "Captain," Hayes said, stepping forward with a new set of reports. "We've intercepted Kranthor communication. They're mobilizing. They've gathered a full fleet, and they're coming for Earth." Drake clenched her fists. "How long until they arrive?" "Not long. The Kranthor are fast when they want to be. We'll have maybe a day or two before they arrive in orbit. If we don't stop them now, we won't get another chance." Drake's mind worked quickly, calculating the risks. They had to strike before the Kranthor could reach Earth's orbit and establish a defensive position. The Resistance had one final card to play, their ultimate weapon. "We have one shot at this," Drake said, her voice hardening with resolve. "We're going to use the last of our experimental weapons to strike at their command ship, the one Zorath is leading. We hit them directly, and we take down their leadership. If we can take Zorath out of the equation, we might just stand a chance." Hayes nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "We're putting everything on the line, Captain."